Congressmen in Washington, D.C. have returned home for the Christmas break without agreeing new aid for beleaguered Ukraine, which continues to fend off the Russian invaders. Supplies of military aid for the country have slowed, and a package from the European Union has been vetoed by Hungary. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, condemnation of Israel's military operation in Gaza is growing. The former British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, accused it of engaging in a killing rage. To discuss whether, as the West gets cold feet, it understands its own interests, I'm joined by former British Army officer Colonel Richard Kemp and former foreign correspondent and author of Reporting the War in Ukraine, Paul Connew. Welcome both to GB News. Richard, may I start with you? How concerned do you feel about the interruption of supplies and, I would say, the lack of commitment now to Ukraine?
Well, first of all, Michael, thank you for having me, and happy Christmas to you and all your viewers from the Holy Land. I'm actually quite close to Nazareth. This is the place, of course, where it all began. In terms of Ukraine, I think the Western world, Europe in particular, and to an extent the US, were becoming, shall we say, war-weary of Ukraine after getting on for 2 years of conflict there, and particularly without much success in the Ukrainian counter-offensive, which began many months ago and has now effectively stalled. And that, on top of that, we've got the situation in the Middle East, which has distracted the attention of so many world leaders, as well as the media, of course, which is pretty important to keeping people focused on Ukraine. And I think that's only added to the war weariness as well. And in addition to which, there is significant amount of military supplies being sent to the Middle East for Israel, which were originally destined for Ukraine. So I think, a combination of events, not least the failure of Ukraine, unfortunately, to make real headway in the offensive, and the Middle East war has been a really serious problem, and I think will develop in a very negative way in the future.
Paul Connew, if I may turn to you. People are now talking about Ukraine losing. President Zelensky is having to deny that his country is losing. Can the West countenance Ukraine losing? What are the consequences, do you think, for the West if Russia is allowed to succeed in Ukraine?
The consequences would be absolutely immense, Michael. Talking a few days ago to some contacts, well placed in Ukraine, media and officials, the thing that's really terrifying, and more than anything else, is the very real prospect of Donald Trump being re-elected in the US, because they think they would certainly be doomed then. But even now, of course, they are worried about what's happening with the US Congress still not sanctioning President Biden's proposed next arms commitment. Also, of course, as you said, Hungary are blocking, and also the new Polish foreign minister returned from Kyiv I think on Friday, saying that arms production in Europe, we are behind the curve, and he's right. I think there's a very real danger that not only is the offensive now blocked, and at stalemate, but Russia are mobilizing, on a complete war economy that Putin is determined to push through. And I think there's a very real danger that Ukraine could lose. And that I think that the message for Europe is actually chilling out of that. It's not just about Ukraine, it's about the potential for Russian expansionism beyond Ukraine.
Paul, then, can I put it to you, if it's evident to me and it's evident to you that the consequences of a Russian victory in Ukraine are appalling for the West, how is it that Europe and the United States appear to be allowing this to happen?
I think there is fatigue in parts of Europe. I think Britain has been absolutely steadfast, but others are less so. And although I'm somebody who is no fan of Boris Johnson, I support his commitment to Ukraine, even though he wants almost sort of mitigated Putin's invasion of Crimea back in the EU campaign in 2016. But since then, I think Boris Johnson, since as Prime Minister, he was solid on that, and Britain needs to stay solid with Ukraine. But I fear that others in Europe are not so committed. And as was said earlier, we have a situation where, in media terms, political terms, diplomatic terms, the situation in Gaza has rather eclipsed, the Ukraine crisis.
Let me go back to Richard Kemp, if I may, and indeed turn to the situation in Israel and Gaza. There has been a big change of tone by Western leaders, much more criticism of Israel and the tactics that it is employing. I was recently in Normandy, and it struck me how many French civilians were killed in the build-up to and the invasion of Normandy in 1944. But we do not seem to be able to apply the same standards, one might argue, to what is happening in Gaza, where the West is really very alarmed indeed by the numbers of civilians who are being killed. Is this change of tone really significant, Richard? And does it show also a kind of lack of stomach for what needs to be done if Israel is to overcome Hamas?
I think there is an element of that as well, and even more recently than the Normandy campaign. Of course, we had the destruction of the Islamic State, not totally destroyed, but the campaign against Islamic State, in which large numbers of civilians were also unfortunately killed by the coalition, which was not focused on in the same way as the campaign in Gaza. I think the reality is that Israel cannot achieve its objectives of defending its civilian population from Hamas without, unfortunately, killing many civilians and probably many more, unfortunately. And that's partly due to the way that Hamas fight. They hide behind human shields. They use the civilian population to protect them. They want Israel to kill their civilian population just so that the world does turn on Israel and pressure Israel to stop. It's part of their long-term tactics and strategy. I would say, however, that I certainly detect from over here that the comments by world leaders, including President Biden and Rishi Sunak, are more for the consumption of the anti-Israel electorate that they obviously have to take account of as well, those people who do not want Israel to prevail in this. And so therefore, some of the comments they're making, I think, are more aimed at them rather than actually attempting to pressurize Israel into stopping fighting or even changing the way they fight. Because I think these leaders, Biden, Sunak and others, recognize that they're well briefed on what's happening. They get detailed daily briefings. They know exactly what's going on, and they know that this is the only way Israel can fight. And I don't detect really very much direct pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu from people like Joe Biden, he's the real man that counts in this outside Israel.
That's an interesting view. Paul Connew, are you in agreement with what you've just heard?
Not really. I'm a great supporter of Israel, but not of the Netanyahu regime. And obviously, I totally condemn Hamas, the terrorist organization, and the events of October the 7th were barbaric and obscene. But I think the current Israel strategy is way over the top. The civilian carnage is unacceptable in human terms and counterproductive. It is only going to create new generations of, if you like, of extremists in our eyes, but obviously not extremists in their eyes, with the consequences of what's happening there. I think Israel could have fought a much more. I know Richard's the military man, and I've been a former war correspondent, not a soldier. But I think the approach could have been different,